Hello again, everybody. Following our previous conversation about Theodore Roosevelt's conservation program, I'd like to now talk about his successor, William Howard Taft, who was a presidential figure who, unfortunately, more often than not, is known principally as a butt of jokes because of his weight, which is unfortunate, um, than he is for his actual tenure as president. And I think that that's unfair on multiple levels. Not only because of the obvious, kind of fat shaming aspect of it, but also because when you look at his record, he, although not a great president by any stretch, wasn't necessarily a bad president either. He just was a very different type of president, and a president that reflected ideas that by the time he became president were fundamentally out of step with what the emerging political consensus and political culture had developed into. And so, in some ways, that's, kind of why he's not as highly regarded. He just wasn't really in keeping with the spirit of his times in many ways. He was kind of old fashioned. Um, but nonetheless, Taft is his presidency is very interesting. He had been handpicked by Roosevelt after serving as the Governor General of the Philippines following the Philippine insurrection. Um, but he had never held public office before being elected to the presidency. He was a lawyer by trade, a specialist in the Constitution, and generally speaking, he was much more comfortable in a courtroom than he was in the political arena. He would actually, in fact, go on to become a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the 1920s, a role for which he was much better suited and which he was generally much happier than he was when he was the President of the United States. Um, but as president, Taft represented kind of for many, a backward movement in American history and in American politics. He fundamentally adhered to the old fashioned ideas of the presidency that had existed during the Gilded Age. He believed that presidents should really fundamentally leave the job of leading public debates to Congress. So he was not a big advocate of the kind of active presidency that Roosevelt had initiated during his tenure. He didn't support and was deeply uncomfortable with the ways in which Roosevelt had expanded executive power, sometimes at the expense of other branches of government, most notably Congress and the courts. And so as a result, he gets this reputation as sort of a stand pat president, who's easily manipulated and who doesn't really, kind of sits on his hands and lets other people do the hard work. Um, that's both accurate and unfair at the same time. It's accurate in the sense that Taft did fundamentally believe in a more limited presidency than Roosevelt did, and was his views on the presidency were much more in keeping with the role that that office had played during the Gilded Age than they were in keeping with the ideas of what the presidency should have been during um, the Progressive era. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't progressive in his own right. Um, Taft was conservative in the classical sense. He, but nonetheless, he did use governmental power to enact progressive aims. And when he came around for reelection in 1912, he in fact portrayed himself as a progressive, um, which is not entirely an inaccurate way of looking at it. Um, for example, during his presidency, he actually or initiated, sorry, nearly twice as many antitrust cases against powerful corporations like DuPont and Standard Oil and various others than Theodore Roosevelt had in nearly 8 years in office. So he's actually a much more aggressive pursuer of clamping down and cracking down on monopolies and bad actors in the economy than Roosevelt had been. But nonetheless, he enjoys his reputation as sort of a tool of powerful interests and kind of representing the old guard of the Republican Party. The Republican Party the at this point is at kind of an inflection point. There's a very clear divide within the party between the old guard, who basically want to return back to the status quo of the Gilded Age, and the progressive wing of the party, represented by people like Theodore Roosevelt and former Wisconsin Governor, now Senator Robert La Follette, who want to move the party in a much more reformist direction. And Taft finds himself kind of caught between those two schools. But he ends up being pretty easily manipulated due to his lack of political experience by the old guard of the party, who play into his conservative philosophy and get him to do things that end up being very unpopular, most notably his efforts to regulate the tariff. In 1909, shortly after becoming president, Taft tries to lower the tariff, which is something that many progressives have long championed, um, but ends up supporting a bill, the Payne-Aldrich bill, that actually raises tariffs and comes to be seen by many as basically a massive example of corporate welfare, a massive giveaway to powerful business interests. Um, and so that, coupled with his less than deft handling of foreign policy, he was not as um, militaristic as Roosevelt had been, and so was reluctant to use military force in Latin America, and instead tried to use what he called dollar diplomacy, which was basically, for the lack of a better way of putting it, economic extortion, trying to extort Latin American countries into doing things that were favorable to the U.S. by withholding economic aid or business opportunities for those countries. In the end, he ends up having to send troops to several countries to enforce American interests in those areas, and ends up looking pretty bad in that arena. And moreover, his kind of lack of clear leadership ultimately cost his party control of Congress in 1910. In the 1910 midterm elections, Democrats portray uh, Taft as a tool of corporate interests, and they managed to use that to sweep control of Congress and to win many key governorships in a number of states, including New Jersey, where they elect the former head of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, as their governor. And so, pretty much immediately after the 1910 congressional midterm elections, uh, Taft kind of takes a back seat to Congress. Um, and it's during this time that Congress actually does do some pretty significant things. To try to once and for all settle the issue of the tariff, Congress ends up passing the 16th Amendment, which allows for the creation of a federal income tax. Um, this was supported by many progressives for a number of reasons. They supported the idea of passing an amendment to allow for a income tax because, one, they wanted to weaken the power of certain powerful corporations, most notably the so-called liquor lobby. About 50% of the government's revenue during this period comes from excise taxes on liquor. And so, one of the reasons why a lot of people support creating a national income tax is because they want to weaken the power of brewers and liquor companies by finding an alternate cash stream for government revenue. The other reason why they support a progressive income tax, which again, the basic idea, what makes it progressive is that it's based on how much people make. The less you make, the less you pay. The more you make, the more you pay. Is that they wanted to also weaken the power of domestic manufacturers that had long used the tariff as a political issue to bribe politicians, to coerce the government into taking actions that benefited them. So passing an income tax was in and of itself seen as something that would help democratize American society, would weaken corporate interests, would weaken lobbying influence, and would make a governmental system that would be more fair, but which would also force people at the very top to pay their fair share in terms of taxation. The other thing that Congress does at this time is they pass another constitutional amendment, the 17th Amendment. This had been a long-time progressive goal going all the way back to the Knights of Labor in the 1870s, when they had called for a constitutional amendment allowing for the direct election of senators. The basic idea behind this was pretty simple. Um, Under the Constitution as it was originally written, state legislatures got to send people to the Senate. The problem with this, of course, was that by the time of the Gilded Age, many of these state legislatures were wholly owned and bought, for the lack of a better way of putting it, by powerful business interests like John D. Rockefeller, various mining interests in the far west, tobacco moguls in the Chesapeake and Piedmont areas of Virginia and North Carolina, etc. And so passing a constitutional amendment to allow voters themselves to select who they sent to the upper chamber was seen as a way of, again, democratizing, small d democratizing American politics and weakening corporate influence. So both of these measures passed during Taft's presidency and are sent to the states for ratification, which they would ultimately receive early in the presidency of Taft's eventual successor, Woodrow Wilson, but are done without much direct consent from Taft or direct input. And this ends up making Theodore Roosevelt very unhappy. Roosevelt had left the United States in 1909, shortly after Taft was inaugurated, to go on a 2-year-long hunting excursion in Africa. When he returned to the United States in 1910, he was not pleased with the way that Taft had, taken over things after he had left the country. And so Roosevelt begins increasingly publicly criticizing Taft for what he sees as his mismanagement of many areas of the American government, his poor foreign policy, his pursuit of antitrust cases, which in some cases were deeply embarrassing for Roosevelt, because they revealed personal relationships with powerful corporations that had not gone explored, and the fact that Taft generally had pursued his presidency in a less active manner than Roosevelt had. So ultimately, Roosevelt decides that he's going to try to unseat Taft, and he's going to run for a third term in office. And he's going to run basically to try to take the nomination from Taft. To do this, he uses the newly created primaries in many states. Remember, one of the big reforms of the Progressive Era was the enactment of direct primaries that let voters choose who they would elect to key offices or for their party for certain positions, instead of having party bosses choose them for them. And Roosevelt easily won many of these primary contests. He was much more popular with the rank and file of the Republican Party than Taft was. Not necessarily party leaders, but with everyday voters, the rank and file voters. And so when they go to have the Republican Party nomination, Roosevelt and his supporters think they've got it in the bag. But to their surprise, Taft won't step aside, and in the end, backdoor negotiations result in the results of primary states being rejected and Taft receiving the nomination, which naturally causes an uproar, and causes many of Roosevelt's supporters and Roosevelt himself to claim that the party elite had stolen the nomination from him. And so, as a result of this, the Republican Party basically splits in 1912 between the reformist progressive wing, represented by Theodore Roosevelt, who splinter off and end up forming a new political organization that they call the Progressive Party, and which puts forward a rather ambitious plank containing many proposals that would eventually make their way into progressive legislation throughout the 20th century, some of which to this day remain unrealized, like the creation of a national healthcare system, for example, while Taft receives the Republican nomination. Um, this sets up one of the most interesting elections in American history. Ultimately, in the election of 1912, there will be no fewer than four major candidates for the presidency: Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressives, William Howard Taft and the Republicans, Woodrow Wilson, who receives the Democratic Party nomination, um, and Eugene V. Debs, who runs under the Socialist Party platform. What's interesting about this is that every single one of these candidates frames themselves as a progressive in the election of 1912, which just illustrates, I think, really quite clearly just how broad of a definition the term progressive really meant for people in the early 20th century. It could mean things, it could mean fairly radical positions like the Socialist Party that Eugene V. Debs represented, slightly less radical, but nonetheless very serious progressive positions like that represented by Theodore Roosevelt, um, more kind of middle of the road positions like Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party, and more conservative but still reformist positions like that adapted by William Howard Taft and the Republican Party. So it's a very interesting election when you look at it that way, just how broad the definition of the term progressive truly could be. Um, in the end, it really becomes a competition between two candidates. Neither Taft or Debs really have a serious shot at the presidency, although Debs actually does manage to win 6% of the popular vote, the most ever given to a socialist candidate in an American general election. Um, it really is a competition between Roosevelt and Wilson. And both come out with two very progressive but very different platforms. Roosevelt comes out with something that he calls the New Nationalism. And it is essentially a blueprint for much of the progressive reforms that would shape the 20th century. It calls for the creation, for the abolition of child labor. It calls for the creation of a federal minimum wage. It calls for what we today call Social Security and old age pension. It calls for the creation of national health care. It adopts women's suffrage as part of its proposals. Um, the list of progressive, um, kind of proposals and agenda items that have shaped everything from the New Deal to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society during the 20th century, many of them can trace themselves back to the new nationalist platform that is adopted by Theodore Roosevelt and the progressives in 1912. Um, it's an agenda that fundamentally favors regulation over the use of the courts, and creating and empowering new government agencies to serve as um, gatekeepers or ombudsmen of various aspects of American society, to basically serve as watchdogs for the American people. And it's very different than the um, platform put forward by Woodrow Wilson, which calls itself the New Freedom. Um, the reason for this is very simple. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. Although he had been the governor of a northern state, New Jersey, he was a Southerner by birth. He was born in Georgia and raised in Virginia. And he was a student of Thomas Jefferson. And basically, he sought to fundamentally take Jefferson's philosophy of democracy, which in its initial incarnation was depend on creating a nation of independent, small landowners, and applying it to the 20th century, replacing the independent, self-sustaining farmer in this case with the independent small business owner as the principal engine of the American economy and of American democracy. It was philosophically and intellectually already outdated by the time he put it forward. But it was nonetheless reflective of Wilson's Southern background, as well as the small business constituency that the Democratic Party at that time sought to cultivate. In the end, um, Taft and Roosevelt effectively split the Republican vote. And so, although he only won a plurality of votes, around 42%, Wilson ends up winning a large share of the Electoral College, an overwhelming majority of votes in the Electoral College, and thus is elected president. Um, the consequences of that and how Wilson pursues his presidency will be the subject of our next video.